Welcome to the webinar today, everybody. The webinar today is how online therapy is saving special ed programs thousands of dollars. We're going to record the webinar and distribute a recording afterwards. So if you have a colleague who was not able to attend, we'll be sending out a copy of the recording to anybody who has registered. My name is Jeremy Glauser, and I'll be going through an introduction today. And George and I will introduce ourselves. Obviously, the webinar is geared toward saving districts dollars, and we'll go into some of that. Let me go into an introduction before we get too much further. I'm Jeremy Glauser, the founder and president of the company, and I have a sincere passion for innovative technologies and special education. I went to school and got a degree in linguistics, which many of you probably are aware is a sister or cousin topic to speech and language pathology, and spent a career in software consulting and management. And online therapy is a perfect marriage of those concepts. The company definitely has met some of my passions and expectations. Our goal is definitely to make affordable services available to as many districts as we possibly can. And I am a lifetime soccer fan. I played soccer all growing up. I love following soccer, even still. I'm a father of three. And I'm going to pass it over to George. George is presenting with me today, and he's our Director of Business Development. He's going to introduce himself briefly.
Hey guys, it's good to participate in this today. I'm really excited to be here and specifically talk about some of the things that we've been researching. You know, one of our primary objectives in all of this is we want to find new ways and practical solutions for educators. We recently met with a group of superintendents who suggested that the workers and especially the directors in special ed have the hardest job in all of education. And so what we would like to do is help develop and innovate practical solutions that are sustainable and that create impact. My background is not in education. I've worked in the film business, and more recently I've worked with a bunch of kids, nonprofits, but the link between those things is impact, and I'm really excited to see what we can do here.
Thanks, George. Let's talk real quick about what you can expect to get from the webinar today. First, we're going to talk a little bit more about online therapy in general and how the different therapy models have evolved over the decades. We'll talk about some blended solutions, and then George is going to go into price versus cost and dig into some analogies and case studies from the experiences and customers that we work with, but also the research that has come from hundreds of articles on the topic. So let me just clear up some potential confusion that you may have. Part of the reason we're doing a webinar is just to announce that VST is now eLuma, and eLuma will be our official name starting Monday, April 3rd. We changed our name because we listened to a lot of our customers. We listened to a lot of the districts that we partner with and agencies that we work with. And changing the name is going to more clearly communicate what we want to do for the kids that we serve. Specifically, bring understanding, enlighten them, help them create life skills that will really benefit them throughout their lives. So if you see eLuma, it's our new name. And we are previously known as VST, which was Virtual Solutions for Therapy. So just briefly about the company so you know who we are standing up here in front of you and talking with you today. We've been established as an organization for 5 years. As I mentioned, previously known as VST. We have a team of 83. We provide therapy services to over 3,500 kids and students in 25 different states. And we deliver speech, OT, PT, counseling, and other services online. That's all we do. So really the information that we're presenting to you is information that we've learned. Now, our commitment to you is to keep this unbiased. We're going to pull out the facts. We're going to pull out what we have learned, not just in our experience, but through partnerships and research. So let's jump into what we know. And what we know is that online speech, online OT, counseling, social work, behavioral intervention are all possibilities now. And you are probably aware of that. That's probably why you're here at the webinar. Online services can also include assessments. Many publishers like Pearson, ProEd, WPS, and many more are adapting those assessments to online. And you may be aware, but the GFTA, the TOLD, the TOEFL, these can all be administered through video conferencing technologies. And I'm assuming it's probably safe to say that you're here because you were attracted to the message of how special education programs could save thousands or extend your resources. It's no secret that funding and extending our funding is always an interest. It's always a topic of what could we do with if we had more resources or we could extend that. So our hope is to not just show you how that is possible, but in conjunction with saving resources and extending resources, how you can improve student outcomes with online therapy. So let's go into what we could do with online therapy. And if you can imagine being able to see progress for every student in real time. So you know how Susan is doing in her speech therapy or OT, and you don't have to wait for that progress report every 3 months. Or what if you were able to bring in specialists and not depend on maybe underqualified individuals as much? Or you could have someone supervise, right? You might have turnover or vacancy issues that plague the district or the school. And instead of focusing resources and time on keeping positions filled, why not bring in specialists or people with specific abilities that could really benefit your students? And what if you could offer families and students the option of on-site or online therapy? We talk with a lot of districts, and a very hot topic recently has been this vision of where online therapy is taking special education. And many districts agree with the vision that we have, and that is someday kids could learn outside of their academic or core general education classes, or they could do it from home. And they could do that all online with a specialist. So those are some of the possibilities of online therapy. And over the years, that model has evolved quite a bit. For those of you who've been in special education for quite some time, you probably can recall back before the turn of the century, in the 90s, most districts had plenty of therapists to staff their needs. A district would go out, put out a job posting, recruit locally, and could find anybody and everybody that they needed for the number of kids in special education. And over the years, that has become more difficult. And you've seen the rise of staffing agencies all over the country. They're national, they're regional, but why do districts go to these staffing agencies? Well, it's because these staffing agencies have a bigger network of therapists to recruit from. And that has become a really important option for districts who can't fill their needs or can't find the specialists that they need. Now, that's even becoming difficult. The growing shortage of therapists in this country is coming close to an epidemic. And we have to think of new ways to meet the needs of our students while improving outcomes. And that's where online therapy has come about. Now, online therapy is not new. Online therapy has been around for over 30 years, and there have been over 30 years of research. But just recently, it's become more applicable with improved technologies, with those who are more willing to adopt it into their districts and at least entertain it. And And so what we've seen is over time, this has definitely evolved, this model. And I want to take a quick detour, and I want to ask some questions from those of you out there in the audience today. And there are two questions that I just posted at the bottom right of our webinar room. I want to talk a little bit about Uber. And if you're not familiar with Uber, that's okay. But I want you to look at those poll questions. The first one is, do you have a car? And then the other question is, have you used Uber? So let me go ahead and broadcast these results. It looks like most of the results are in. So you'll see the results here as I broadcast these. But what you'll notice is that everybody has a car that's in the webinar today. That doesn't surprise me, honestly. And then if you look at how many have used Uber, 60% of you have used Uber. And I want to dig into that a little bit more and explain what Uber is. Uber is simply a car service. It's kind of like a taxi service, but you pull up an app on your phone. You see there are many drivers for Uber that are nearby. And when you put out a request for a ride to a specific destination, the first Uber driver to accept it will come and pick you up within minutes. And why do people even use Uber? I'm sure many of you would probably have some answers to that question, but really it boils down to it creates value for us, and it allows us to do more, right? All of us own a car, but more than half of us have used Uber. Why? Well, I know for me, I've used Uber when I go on a vacation. I don't have my car on my vacation, and it's less expensive and more convenient to use Uber when I need it than to rent a car, figure out where to park, pay the fees, and all of the things associated with that. Sometimes I use an Uber when I go downtown because I know parking downtown is going to be a pain in the neck. But it offers convenience, it's dependable, and on top of that, it's affordable, right? All of those pieces combined make it valuable to me. And I imagine that many of you who've used it before find it valuable for many of the same reasons. And it's all based on context. You have a car because you need a car where you live to go get groceries, to go to the movies, to go to a friend's or family's home. But you use an Uber in different contexts. And what I put up here are some different reasons and different contexts that you might use an Uber. One of them is as a compliment. A compliment suggests that you still own a car, but you're going to use an Uber to help you and bring value to you in various contexts. So some of those contexts are listed out here that you can read. Maybe you own a car and you're able to drive, but you just choose not to occasionally. Or you own a car, but you use an Uber to avoid traffic, parking, and a hassle. But on the other side of this slide, you'll see that some people might use it as a substitute. So instead of owning a car, maybe they're downtown New York. We have some New Yorkers here in the room with us today. You may not want to have a car downtown. It's more convenient to walk for most things. But then when you need it, occasionally, you'll go get an Uber, and an Uber driver will be there within minutes to take you to a destination. So there are many contexts for which you will complement car ownership, but maybe substitute car ownership. And I want to apply this a little bit to your experience in special education, because you have had a context for on-site therapists who will work with maybe some difficult caseloads, but then there is a context for online therapy. And that's what we are seeing more and more as more and more districts are adopting this method of delivering services. So one of the big things that online therapy can do, and it's kind of taken for granted, is staffing with more precision. So even though you have an on-site therapist, you might want to staff a need that you have with greater precision. And you can hire someone online part-time or three-quarters time or full-time, whatever that may be. So you don't have to do a lot of that heavy lifting with the recruiting piece. You don't have to hire a full-time person. You don't have to worry about the understaffing or overstaffing issues, right? So that leads us to some different models. Just like you might use Uber in certain contexts with car ownership, you might use online therapy with on-site therapy in certain contexts, whether it's group or individual sessions, or it's a blended model. And there are 3 blended models that are very typical across the nation right now in the services that we provide. And these are services that districts have naturally wanted to implement. And so let me look at each of these in a little bit more depth with you. The first blended model we're calling Tandem. And what you'll see is here at the left, you've got a therapist who's on site working with a student who is physically at the school. But then you've also got a therapist who's online working with a student who's physically at the school, but maybe on the computer. And the one who's on site might work with caseloads who are more difficult, or maybe just caseloads who are a better fit for on-site services. Whereas the online therapist will work with those who are a better fit for online and might progress better with an online therapist or specialist, right? So you divide and you conquer. The other model that's very common is you've got an online specialist or a supervisor. So we call this one the supervised model, because you've got someone on site who might be a CFY or might be a CODA. You may have an assistant or an aide who is able to do direct therapy, but not a master's level or as highly credentialed. And that on-site person being supervised is working with these kiddos who are on-site as well. So there are different ways that you could bring in specialists, you could divide and conquer, but in some cases, you just need an online therapist because you don't have any other options. You don't have an on-site therapist to provide the services that you need. So an online therapist can fill in the gaps. They can provide all of the services that you might need, from caseload management to assessment to online therapy. So in the context of this Uber analogy, we've got the ability to work, right? You've got the on-site, which is the equivalent of car ownership, or the online therapist, which is the equivalent of Uber, and different contexts for which you'll use and divide and conquer. And we found that this analogy is really helpful when you're thinking, oh, how do I manage this? How do I find value? And really, this leads into the discussion of how districts are saving thousands. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to George, and George is going to talk through the price versus cost, what goes into that, and he's going to give us a case study.
You guys are going to have to bear with us a little bit today because we're going to use another car analogy. It was not intentional, but it nonetheless seemed most appropriate. We recently had the privilege of attending the national conference for CASE and NASD, their national convention in Milwaukee. I believe it was in September. And we did a survey there amongst a lot of the special education directors and the various administrators that were in attendance. And one of the questions that we asked them was, what are your biggest reservations with regards to using online therapy? And really, it boiled down to 3 primary answers, specifically amongst the departments that weren't presently using online therapy services. The first one, and by a significant distance, was cost. And there's a general perception in the special education world that online therapy is far too expensive. Secondary to that was, does it work? And third to that was, what are parents going to think? Today we're going to talk specifically about the perceived cost versus the price versus the real cost. Because what we're finding is that in many cases, online therapy is very cost competitive. In some cases, it provides savings. But we do want to kind of look at all of this through the lens of context, because each and every school, each and every district has a whole different set of variables. They have a different set of needs. And while many have similar objectives, the objectives aren't always quite as identical. And so we want to factor that in. But let's start with this analogy. We're going to talk about two cars real briefly. We're going to start with the Dodge Dart Arrow, and then we're going to move to the Toyota Prius, and we're going to compare these two cars. And I'm going to just put a little table up right here. Some of the basic features of these cars, they're in the same competing class. They're direct competitors. So this would imply substitution, but for the sake of our demonstration today, it can be considered in other ways as well. As you kind of go down the list, you can see that in some ways the Dodge Dart, it's faster, has a more powerful engine. It's a very good car, it gets good mileage. Looking down the Prius side, you can see that it's maybe a little bit more fuel efficient, rates a little bit higher on the quality. But then you get down to price, and there's a pretty stark differential. With these factors considered, what car would you choose? What would you deem the better value? All things being relatively equal, what would you choose? We're going to throw up a little online poll here, and I'd love to see, what your thoughts are. So it looks like we've got some folks choosing the Dart. Okay. So which car do you choose? Okay, so we're choosing the Dart. Okay, so let's move a little bit further, because we might reveal some things that are going to be interesting, because we want you to look at special education in this same way. Consumer Reports several years ago came out with a different way of looking at car ownership and the cost of owning it, and they call it the real cost of ownership. And what they do is, above and beyond price, they factor in a whole host of things that affect how much money you spend on your car every month. And so when you start to look at these two cars through the context of real cost, it starts to paint a little bit of a different picture. Sure, the Dodge Dart is about $6,000 to $7,000 cheaper, but when you look at the annual cost of ownership, it becomes very telling. Your annual cost is almost $2,000 a year more. The metric that CR and Edmunds and Kelley Blue Book uses, they use the 5-year cost of ownership. They all have their variation of it. But when you look at the 5-year cost of ownership, with the Dodge Dart Arrow, it's nearly $9,000 more. And so we see a lot of scenarios with special education where it's very much the same. We try to peel away the layers of the onion. We try to factor in all the costs. And what we're seeing is that a lot of special education directors and superintendents and administrators aren't always factoring in the real cost. They look strictly at the price versus the cost. If you're looking at on-site therapy versus online therapy, if you're looking at the price, we've factored in the ASHA 2016 average salary for a speech-language pathologist. It comes to $62,000 a year. If you factor in the national average of hours worked in a school year, that price comes to $45.93 an hour. If you look at an aggregate of online therapy services, you're probably, for an equivalent type of pathologist, paying $75 an hour. And if you're making a decision strictly on cost, not on need or anything else, if this is your criteria, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go with online therapy. And this probably explains the feedback that we got at the convention from the survey. But what happens when we start to layer in the real costs that come with employing a speech-language pathologist or an occupational therapist or a physical therapist or whatever therapist you need in your special education department? We begin to see a little bit of a different picture coming into play. So let's talk about some of these items. One of the items that we have are, we have salary. But above and beyond that, you have an employer payroll tax. According to Economic Policy Institute, the national average in education is 7.4%. Kind of moving down the line, you move to benefits, pensions, insurances. And again, we see that a national average is coming in at around 27%. Again, let's factor in paid absences. You have a national average of 6.6%. This means that 6.6% of the time, you're paying someone to do something where they're not even coming to work to do. And so that does kind of factor in. Signing bonuses can come into play, certainly stipends as well. These are things you don't typically pay when you hire an online therapist. Kind of moving down the list, there's other therapist expenses. There's professional development. You have computer and equipment and supplies and software and some of these other things. Many of you employ therapists that have to, engage in windshield time, that they move from school to school to school. There's certainly mileage and other travel expenses that come into play for some of you. Again, these are costs that typically don't appear in the online column. So we're going to move a little bit towards a different topic, but nonetheless, it's a real therapy cost, and that would be turnover. And what we're seeing in the data is that it's becoming quite a national problem. We've seen several studies specifically on turnover in special education, and those rates, depending on the year, are ranging between 12.3% to about 20%. We saw one study that suggested 22%, but we're going to throw that out as an outlier. But nonetheless, that indicates that the turnover is quite problematic. And this problem is compounded by the fact that we're in the middle of a demographic shift. Presently, the US population is getting older. And this is affecting special education in a couple of ways. First, what we're seeing is an aging therapist population that is poised for retirement in the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, in the next 10 years, up to 46% of therapists will be retiring. Probably more critical to this is the fact that healthcare is now requiring many of these same services. And unfortunately, healthcare tends to pay quite a bit more, to the tune of 47% annually more. And so we're seeing exit attrition both through retirement, and we're seeing tremendous exit attrition into healthcare. What this is doing is it's creating a national shortage. Right now, 49 states are suggesting that they're in shortage, and above and beyond this, the Bureau of Labor Statistics last year suggested that the shortage is persistent and serious, and they called it acute. We plugged in some of the numbers on shortage, and this is based on the data that we're getting from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from ASHA, and several other sources. We're showing an increasing shortage. So if you think the problem is bad now, we're projecting in the next 10 years it could as much as quadruple. And so again, our point is not to talk, and to go in depth into shortage and turnover, but it is to acknowledge that it is a reality for you. It is a cost, and moving forward, it could become a more problematic. We're kind of thinking that there's going to be more turnover in the coming years, and we kind of think that there's going to be a lot more shortage with this. And so how does that affect the bottom line? How does that affect cost? Well, we know that there are several quantifiable turnover costs. There's certainly the separation costs. There's costs that come with the vacancy, especially prolonged vacancies. And what we're seeing nationally right now is that up to 8% of all positions are vacant right now with regards to therapy. Above and beyond that, we're seeing growing caseloads. When districts can't hire the right people, when they can't find the person, they're basically dumping those excess cases onto the other clinicians. Above and beyond that, we're seeing a high number of unqualified individuals being asked to do things that they're not qualified to do. Certainly recruitment is a tough thing, and it's going to get tougher. You have background and credentialing, and then you get into induction and training and retention activities. And these are all very expensive, they're time consuming, they're distracting. Now, we talk about quantifying these costs, but the truth of the matter is it's very difficult to calculate. There have been several studies done on turnover in special education. We've looked at multiple models. And one of the models that we look at is the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor. They have a model that is applied, and it's kind of our default model. It's a 30% of departing therapist salary is what they estimate the real cost of turnover to be. Some models go more in depth and go as high as 200%, but as our baseline, we stick to 20 to 30% of that cost. But above and beyond that, you have other costs that are less quantifiable. You have performance loss, which means that when you lose a good therapist, you're losing their experience, you're losing their quality. You can't always reproduce their output by going and hiring someone else. And above and beyond that, if they've been a part of your program for several years, you've probably invested thousands in them, and you lose that investment, so to speak. As you lose a therapist, sometimes it can affect student achievement, and that means you're losing your continuity, you're losing those services, and if you have a persistent vacancy, that definitely has bearing on the student achievement. Of course, it affects the program's stability, and for you, it creates a headache, and that's manifest in the form of distraction and time loss and stress. What else could you be doing if you're not having to deal with turnover? How is that affecting your performance? How is that affecting your department? Certainly that has an economic and financial impact, but we can't presently quantify what that is. Above and beyond that, certain situations this can create compliance issues. How is it affecting you with regards to due process? Is it taking you out of qualification for your federal funding? And certainly there's a public relations component. And you lump all of these things together and you look at all the stakeholders, all the people that are involved in providing and receiving therapy, all the way from the administrators to the therapists, all the way through to the families and students. You can see a reduction in morale, and that definitely can have an impact on you. Kind of moving on, we're suggesting some of these other costs. One of the things that we're calling is the cost of non-therapy hours. This is a highly variable thing as you go from district to district, and it's really contingent on the experience of the therapist. It's contingent on caseload. It's contingent on kind of the paperwork load, and then it's contingent on travel. ASHA did release last year a work week for the average speech therapist. They're suggesting that the ratio of direct to indirect hours is 64 to 36%. So in other words, for every hour a therapist works, 38 minutes are spent in therapy. Online operates quite a bit differently. There are a lot of efficiencies associated with the processes that surround how online therapy is delivered. So one way that you can realize a greater efficiency and savings is knowing that when you engage an online therapist, on average, you're going to get about 48, sometimes more, minutes of therapy for every hour you pay the therapist. So that's something to definitely consider in. Lastly, wanted to look at a couple of costs. Jeremy talked about precision hiring, and we feel like that there is a cost there, and it's more manifest in the form of an opportunity cost. But the idea being that in most cases, when you have a need, you have to go out and hire in full-time increments. What happens when you have an increase in need, but you don't need to go hire another full-time person? Some districts have the ability to hire part-time. Most districts don't. And we feel like there is a loss in that opportunity because you can't hire exactly to your need. Above and beyond that, you have training and mentorship, especially when you have new therapists coming on. In many cases, mentorship can be a distraction for your more experienced therapists because you're pulling them out of therapy opportunities to go train newer ones. Definitely you have management support and you have overhead. So what we're going to do, we're going to take some of these things and we're going to kind of layer them all together. And it's going to look something like this. When we typically talk to districts, when we try to estimate what their real cost of therapy is, in other words, what does it cost them to provide a therapy hour, it looks a little bit something like this. And so with that, you can see we've plugged in the national averages here. I'm going to move to another slide where it takes us to something that's a little more readable. Typically, when we talk to people, we take more time to break down these costs and what drives us there. But you'll see that based on a national average, I'm throwing up the price per hour that we had earlier. When we layer in the real costs of therapy, it starts to look a little bit different. And you can start to see that, you know, in this case of just substituting the national average of on-site therapy with the average of online therapy, you can start to see that there's, you know, quite a differential, you know, and that can be from anywhere from 3 to 12%. As we get into certain districts, into some more expensive markets, the difference becomes actually quite a bit more stark. And so on a national average basis, you can start to see that online therapy not only is not too expensive in most cases, but it can actually start to provide savings and a value. And we kind of want to go back to this Uber analogy that, of course, each district is unique. Context matters. And so you do want to look at the varying factors, and online as a solution, you know, it can make a lot of sense as a substitute, that when you need a new therapist, when you can't find a new therapist, it definitely can deliver there. And in many cases, it can deliver savings and value. But beyond that, it can provide a complementary sort of value, and it can provide savings in different ways through specialization, through different application where we can move and discharge students more. So,
right, and to bring it back, like George is saying, what we're telling you, the research that we've done, the customers and the district partners that we've worked with, what it comes down to, what it comes back to is, like this car ownership and using Uber as a service, you can bring more value to your own life. On-site and online therapy blended together can offer not just efficiencies and flexibilities, but it can also bring a lot of savings. So we're not suggesting that districts go and replace all on-site staff with online staff. As a matter of fact, we would recommend that you don't do that in most cases, because the complement of an online and on-site staff member together really does have an impact. So with that, we're going to take some questions. We'll stick around until